The hearing will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Before I deliver my opening remarks, I wanted to note that today the committee is meeting both in person and virtually. I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of this hearing. First, members and staff who are attending in person and are unvaccinated against COVID-19 must stay masked throughout the hearing. Unvaccinated members may remove their mask only during the questioning under the 5-minute rule. Members who are attending virtually should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones. Please also keep your microphones muted until you are speaking. And finally, if members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address was circulated prior to the hearing. I have a letter here from GPS Innovation Alliance to be entered into the hearing record, and without objection, so ordered. Good morning, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. We rely on the radio frequency spectrum in countless ways every day. We use it for GPS, communicating with friends and family, scientific research, weather forecasting, and much more. But spectrum is a finite resource. And as more technologies are developed and deployed, like 5G, the demand for spectrum continues to increase. One might think of the radio frequency spectrum as similar to a trendy neighborhood that is attracting a lot of new people. As more residents seek to move in, you might rezone the size of the lots to make them smaller and convert some parking spaces for bike lanes. You might have to install some new traffic lights. The longtime tenants understandably want to maintain their way of life, but they will inevitably have to make some adjustments. And if a noisy new tenant moves in, it's a problem for the house next door. It is analogous to the situation that have arisen due to the increasing demands on the radio frequency spectrum. This committee recognizes the importance of 5G development and supports advancing the technology, but we must be thoughtful about how we proceed. We must ensure that as we deploy 5G and other new technologies, we do not threaten critical Earth and space science observations. Meteorologists have expressed concern for years about increased demand and usage of spectrum. They understand the importance of protecting access to spectrum bands needed for scientific observation. NOAA and NASA raised serious concerns to both the committee and the FCC about the potential for critical satellite data loss as a result of interference from the 24 gigahertz band. In fact, former acting NOAA Administrator Neil Jacobs stated before the committee that the proposed spectrum auction for 24 gigahertz will result in a degraded forecast scale by as much as 30%. Therefore, Ranking Member Lucas and I requested that FCC delay the auction until the concerns were addressed. Unfortunately, the FCC proceeded with the auction of 24 gigahertz with minimal limits on out-of-band emissions. Thankfully, the United States is party to an international treaty on spectrum use. Other nations advocated for a more stringent emissions limit at the World Radio Conference in December of 2019. The concerns of the science community should be partially addressed when FCC conforms its emission limits with the international standards. But we are only in a better place for weather observation because of the advocacy of other nations. The United States spectrum management process failed our nation's forecasters, the astronomers, and climate scientists. Ranking Member Lucas and I requested that the Government Accountability Office conduct a report on how these concerns were considered and addressed during the 24 gigahertz auction process. The report was released yesterday. It makes clear that a number of federal agencies have a lot of work to do to improve this process. I know the United States has what it takes to fix this. If we can establish a more coordinated, whole of government approach to spectrum management, we can enable U.S. telecommunications leadership and protect important Earth and space science observations. The committee will be asking for accountability from both federal science agencies and the FCC, as well as we all learn to live in a more crowded spectrum neighborhood. I am pleased we are joined by Mr. Von Ogg of the Government Accountability Office, who can shed more light on their report. And our other witnesses can speak to the importance of protecting spectrum for existing federal science applications. They will also help us consider strategies to better address these very legitimate concerns. Finally, I also want to thank Ranking Member Lucas for his staff for working arm in arm with me and my staff on the topic. I now will recognize Mr. Lucas for his opening statement.
Thank you for holding a hearing on this important subject, Chairwoman Johnson. Spectrum allocation may not always receive front-page news coverage, but it affects our lives daily. We use the spectrum for everything from transmitting cell phone signals to broadcasting radio stations to monitoring weather patterns. Farmers who use GPS to engage in precision agriculture rely on clear spectrum frequencies. Scientists use data from orbiting satellites to forecast severe weather events that rely on the spectrum also. And in the future, rural Americans may receive faster, more reliable broadband internet thanks to orbiting satellite constellations using the spectrum. Today's hearing is timely as it comes a day after the Government Accounting Office released a report requested by this committee evaluating the interagency process for allocating spectrum when there are different interests at play. The report makes it clear that the existing process is flawed and highlights a number of instances in which coordination fell apart. We can't afford to have this happen again. At our request for this GAO evaluation was prompted by a continuous process leading up to the 2019 spectrum auction, which was intended to help spur the development of new 5G cellular technology infrastructure. All of this came before the 2019 World Radio Communication Conference, where the U.S. was negotiating updated spectrum allocation regulations and coordination with countries around the world. Ahead of the auction, the weather community raised significant concerns about the potential loss of forecasting data due to the spillover from adjoining spectrum bands, which would be used for 5G. This committee heard testimony from federal agencies such as NASA and NOAA about the potential negative effects of this auction. The acting administrator of NOAA told us that our forecasting accuracy could be degraded by as much as 30%. That could have dangerous consequences for families and businesses and our ability to protect lives and property in severe weather. As I said at the time, we all support the deployment of 5G. Advanced wireless communications offers many economic development opportunities for our constituents and helps us remain competitive with China. With the growth of remote work and education since the pandemic, having reliable and fast connectivity is even more important now than ever. But spectrum allocation decisions cannot be about choosing connectivity over forecasting. We have a responsibility to seek a balance between the needs of the federal users and non-commercial users of spectrum for commercial users of spectrum. That's why the release of this GAO report is important. It identified a number of flaws and gaps in the processes for resolving interagency disagreements over spectrum allocation, as well as incidents in which agencies failed to coordinate effectively. The report also offers 11 recommendations for executive action, which would result in an improved process in the future. It is critical that the Science Committee work with the other committees of jurisdiction to ensure that the agencies address these recommendations. All stakeholders, from federal agencies to private companies, need a spectrum allocation process that is fair, transparent, and provides certainty for decision making, particularly as we negotiate internationally over spectrum issues. Regulatory instability is bad for business and can be especially lethal to satellites if regulations are not internationally harmonized, since satellite signals do not stop at borders. It is important that we note that the issues surrounding the spectrum allocation process in 2019 were not the first time spectrum allocations have been the source of controversy, and will certainly not be the last time either. Indeed, the importance of spectrum allocation will continue to grow as we face increased utilization of 5G devices and the Internet of Things. This is a challenging topic and one which will require multiple federal agencies working together to modernize existing processes and multiple congressional committees working in tandem to ensure that we address these issues in the most effective manner, both nationally and internationally. That being said, I'm confident we can find a path forward. I want to thank our panel witnesses for appearing before us today. They represent a variety of experts on spectrum issues who can speak to how the federal interagency process is intended to work and how it has worked previously, and ways federal agencies and Congress can work to improve the process moving forward. With that, Madam Chair, I thank you, and I very much appreciate all of our work together, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. Now we'll introduce the witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Andrew Van Ark. Mr. Van Ark is a director in the Government Accountability Office, the GAO's physical infrastructure team. He oversees a portfolio including the management and regulation of spectrum, deployment of broadband infrastructure, and emergency communications. He previously served as acting director of GAO's Defense Capabilities Management Team and assistant director for physical infrastructure. While at the GAO, his scope of work has included aviation, telecommunications, and surface transportation issues. The next witness is Mr. David Lubar. Mr. Lubar is a senior project leader in the Civil Systems Group at the Aerospace Corporation. He advises on spectrum for the program offices of the Joint Polar Satellite System and the Geostationary Operational Environmental Satellite System R series. He also delivers all aspects of spectrum support for space systems with an emphasis on environmental satellite systems. Our third witness is Dr. Jordan Girth. Mr. Girth is an honorary fellow for the Space Science and Engineering Center at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. I will note that Dr. Girth also serves as a physical scientist for the National Weather Service under NOAA. However, his service began subsequent to the 23.8 gigahertz controversy in spring of 2019. He is appearing today in his capacity as a leading researcher on spectrum needs for atmospheric science and not as a representative of the agency. I encourage members to address their questions accordingly. His research focuses on the transition of meteorological observations, particularly remote sensing, into operational weather forecasting. He is currently developing the NWS requirements and a mission concept for the next generation of geostationary weather satellites under the GeoXO program. After Dr. Girth is Mr. Bill Mahoney. Mr. Mahoney is director of the Research Applications Laboratory at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He has led the weather-related R&D programs for NCAR for more than 35 years on topics including aviation, intelligent forecast systems, wildfire behavior prediction, and renewable energy. His experience includes scientific research facilitating inter-laboratory science, technology commercialization, promoting diversity and inclusion, and supporting transdisciplinary sciences. Our final witness is Ms. Jennifer Manor. Ms. Manor is a Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs of the EchoStar Corporation, Hughes Network Systems of LLC, where her portfolio includes spectrum management, new technology, and market access. Previously, she was a senior counsel to FCC Commissioner Kathleen Abernathy, with responsibility for wireless, international, and new technology issues. She has served on the Federal Advisory Committee for Communications, Spectrum Management, and World Radio Communications. She has also published several books on telecommunications issues and on spectrum specifically. As our witnesses should know, you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony, and your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin questions, and each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. We'll start with Mr. Van Aar.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee, I'm pleased to be here today as you examine the federal spectrum management process. Regulating and managing the diverse uses of spectrum are complex and challenging tasks. They involve accommodating the growing needs of emerging technologies, protecting existing uses from harmful interference, and balancing the concerns of various spectrum users, all with the goal of promoting the most efficient and effective use of the spectrum resource in the public interest. The recent FCC proceeding known as Spectrum Frontiers revealed these challenges, leading to federal agencies having disagreements about how to protect instruments on weather satellites from interference from 5G wireless signals in the 24 gigahertz spectrum band. Leading in 5G and leading in weather forecasting are both important national goals with billions of dollars in potential benefits associated with them. The disagreements came to light during the U.S.'s preparatory work for the 2019 World Radio Conference, where FCC, NTIA, NOAA, and NASA did not agree on which U.S. studies and positions to present internationally. This created challenges for the U.S.'s ability to present a unified position or an agreed-upon technical basis for the conclusions the U.S. ultimately supported. My statement today is based on our report released yesterday, which examined the extent to which the federal agencies followed leading practices in collaborating on potential interference effects on weather forecasting, and how agencies conduct and review technical studies that can predict and model the extent of interference. With respect to collaboration, we found that the mechanisms used by the agencies do not fully reflect key collaboration practices. For example, 2 key documents, the Memorandum of Understanding between FCC and NTIA, and the General Guidance Document that guides technical and other preparatory work for international proceedings, have no defined and agreed upon processes for resolving matters when agencies cannot do so. Indeed, it was because these mechanisms broke down with respect to reaching consensus that the U.S. could not present a position with an agreed upon technical basis. Notably, the MOU and the General Guidance Document have not been updated in almost 20 years, despite growing demand on spectrum resources. Further, during the FCC proceeding, both internal processes and clear expectations were lacking for how and when NOAA and NASA were to participate and raise interference concerns. For example, FCC requested comments on actions it was considering related to the 24 gigahertz spectrum band as early as 2014, but NOAA and NASA did not submit comments until several years later. By the time the 2 agencies had provided comments, FCC had already decided to take action. Thus, the agencies missed opportunities to ensure that FCC received and considered their input. With regard to the agency's work on technical interference studies, in this case, NOAA and NASA prepared studies for the 2019 conference following the guidance and standards developed by international parties. Although FCC was a party to the international groups that developed these guidelines and standards, FCC later disputed those ultimately used by NOAA and NASA in the design and preparation of their studies. Without agreed upon procedures to conduct and review the studies or clear steps on how to resolve the lack of consensus, the agencies were unable to move forward. As a result, the U.S. did not submit its studies on certain key issues to the final technical meeting, resulting in some stakeholders questioning whether the corresponding U.S. positions were technically rooted. In our report, we made recommendations to FCC, NTIA, and to NOAA to address these gaps. Specifically, we made 5 recommendations to both FCC and NTIA. First, to establish processes for making decisions on spectrum management activities that involve other agencies, particularly when consensus cannot be reached. Second, to clarify and further identify shared goals for spectrum management activities. Third, to update the FCC NTIA MOU to address the identified gaps and to continually monitor and update this agreement. Fourth, to request that state initiate a review of the general guidance document in consultation with other relevant participants, and to continually monitor and update this document. And lastly, to establish procedures to help guide the design of spectrum sharing and potential interference studies. Additionally, we recommended that NOAA clarify and document its processes for identifying and raising concerns about potential interference to NOAA satellite instruments. We would note that NASA, during the course of our review, did just that. The agencies all agreed to work collaboratively to implement these recommendations, which we believe will at least create a framework where disagreements can be resolved based on agreed upon technical findings. Madam Chairwoman, this concludes my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions you or other members of the committee may have.
Thank you very much. We'll now hear from Mr. Lubar.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee for this hearing. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute today. It is an honor to be asked to testify on an issue that brings together 2 areas that have been central to my technical work over the last 35 years. The scientific use of passive sense data from space for environmental applications and the spectrum management aspects of space systems. I work for the Aerospace Corporation on spectrum management as it relates to meteorological satellites and space systems. For those who may be unfamiliar with Aerospace, we are a nonprofit that was established by the U.S. Congress in 1960 to provide independent and objective technical advice to military, intelligence, and civil space programs. As a federally chartered nonprofit, our only motivation is to help the U.S. achieve success in its space missions. My 35 years of spectrum experience includes 2 major environmental satellite programs for NOAA, one of which is the Joint Polar Satellite System, or JPSS. JPSS has a sounder instrument, specifically a microwave radiometer, which performs passive measurements worldwide in 22 passive frequency bands, including the 23.8 gigahertz spectrum. This sensor is essential to the timeliness and accuracy of weather predictions around the world, because making passive measurements of subtle atmospheric conditions from space requires listening very carefully for natural phenomena against a background of human-created electromagnetic energy from our billions of radios. I have become very familiar with the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, study process, and closely monitored the study reports and discussions through the ITU that resulted in the 24 gigahertz spectrum emission limits in 2019. Today, I want to make 3 main technical points to the committee. First, that the same regulatory protection limits cannot be applied to a space-based passive sensor and a smartphone or other communications receiver. Their operation and sensitivities are vastly different because passive weather sensors are measuring the very subtle noise floor. Most communication engineers consider the noise floor unusable and would not be concerned with emissions at or below that level. Second, that moderate levels of contamination caused by radio frequency interference created by neighboring services are harder to identify and hence more damaging than the very high or very low levels. And third, that there is no mitigation for such contamination of weather sensors. The best one can do is identify that contamination and avoid propagating that data into supercomputers and weather models. I also want to make the overarching point that scientific input into the spectrum regulatory process is essential for successful and informed outcomes. Communication receivers, such as those on our smartphones or on our ground stations, rely on an active transmitted signal originating from an antenna to carry our voice or videos. But space-based passive sensors are very different technologies that do not have the same functionality or protection requirements. Unlike communication receivers, these satellite microwave radiometers are extremely sensitive power measurement devices for detecting energy emissions. One analogy about the sensitivity of space-based passive measurements: it's like trying to hear a whisper in San Francisco while standing 500 miles away in San Diego. Please cue up the slide. Passive measurement instruments seek to measure the minute natural variations in the noise floor. What is a noise floor? While this is a complex technical subject, the term noise refers to unwanted electrical signals that are always present in electrical systems. The primary natural source of noise in radio systems that cannot be eliminated is caused by the thermal motion of electrons. Space-based radiometers use the radio spectrum noise floor to measure the weak emissions of the atmosphere. From these data, temperature, water vapor, and other values may be determined. You may take down the slide. In closing, I would like to highlight that the scientific input into the spectrum regulatory process is essential. For example, in the future, the FCC may consider service rules for terrestrial services adjacent to passive bands, such as the 50 gigahertz passive bands used to determine atmospheric temperatures. The passive measurements in that band are critical contributors to weather models. I'm heartened that this hearing is being held to examine these issues, and I would like to thank the committee for this opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Girth.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing and thank you for the invitation to testify today. You implicitly recognize the importance of radio frequencies for Earth and space science applications. My testimony today will focus particularly on the criticality of protecting the clarity of Earth-emitted radio frequencies to maintain the quality and public confidence in weather warnings and forecasts, and the need for transparent processes to facilitate that objective. While visible or infrared satellite imagery, as shown on the evening weather report, partially contributes to the quality of weather forecast, the most valuable frequencies are microwaves, particularly those between 20 and 200 gigahertz. It likely comes as a surprise to many that the Earth's atmosphere emits microwaves, but they are naturally occurring and not harmful to us. Improvements in numerical weather prediction performance over the past 20 years can be attributed to satellite observations, especially microwave sensing of water vapor, such as at 23.8 gigahertz and other frequencies. Today, approximately 15 to 30% of the assimilated observations are from passive microwave sensing. If there is no observation of a portion of the atmosphere because of 5G signal interference there, it cannot be the basis for a weather analysis, and global and local forecasts may suffer alike, leading to a loss of lead time for storms. Using a 5G inflated observation could lead to a worse forecast unless numerical weather models are configured to use microwave observations with a decreased confidence in their quality, a mitigation that would have far-reaching complications for weather forecasts beyond where there is interference. As part of the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act of 2017, NOAA is required to conduct an Observing System Simulation Experiment, or OSSI, before buying or leasing a new weather satellite. This directive could be expanded, potentially using spectrum auction revenues. NOAA, NASA, and other government agencies that operate satellites for environmental sensing should regularly audit the use of spectrum, and recent peer-reviewed studies from federal and federally supported scientists should reflect the application and value of each radio frequency sense. In light of the GAO findings and recommendations, I am left wondering what recourse NOAA or NASA has if the FCC and or the Department of State does not allay their raised concerns about shared spectrum rulemaking proposals. Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas were rightfully concerned about the potential for weather forecast degradation and calling for the GAO to investigate the governmental processes that have led us to this point. Yet, as a scientist, it is discomforting that the FCC can conduct rulemaking without studies that could have an impact on another agency to accomplish its congressionally directed mission. This committee should consider whether oversight or involvement from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, federal advisory committees, or other mechanisms that, at a minimum, conduct and make publicly available all relevant scientific studies prior to a rulemaking decision may facilitate a process with more integrity for all stakeholders. Despite the importance of maintaining the accuracy of weather forecasts, the weather enterprise is not a competitor of the telecommunications industry, and we should not characterize this issue as one of us versus them. The telecommunications industry is an essential partner in delivering urgent weather messages to Americans. I truly believe that with a better understanding of how satellite sensors collect weather information and how those observations improve weather forecasts, that industry partners can work with us to deploy equipment outside of pre-existing bands for Earth sensing. In our national conversations about 5G, we are forward-looking into how technology will evolve the economy, expand opportunities, connect Americans, and improve society. We should apply the same mindset to weather prediction and satellite observations. The United States has been a leader in weather satellite observations that now extends back 60 years, a history that began in Wisconsin, the birthplace of satellite meteorology. We should continue our national leadership in demonstrating stewardship of our spectrum resources for science applications and particularly weather sensing. Thank you for holding this hearing and allowing me to explain the science that underlies the importance of passive microwave sensing for weather forecasting and how processes that require scientific input can benefit from increased transparency. I appreciate your support in increasing confidence in our nation's weather warnings and forecasts and maximizing the value of the United States investment in weather sensing from space. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mahoney.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is William Mahoney, and I currently serve as an Associate Director of the National Center for Atmospheric Research. The National Center for Atmospheric Research is a federally funded research and development center of the National Science Foundation, and it is operated by the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, which is a nonprofit consortium of more than 120 North American colleges and universities focused on research and training in Earth system sciences. I've also had the privilege of previously serving as the commissioner of the American Meteorological Society's Commission on the Weather, Water, and Climate Enterprise, which is charged with addressing the needs and concerns of the public, private, and academic sectors of the United States weather, water, and climate enterprise. The nation's economy and the public demand accurate weather information. Remote observations of the Earth that utilize radio frequency channels, such as those operating in the atmospheric absorption bands, provide critical data sets required for weather prediction and the provision of warnings to save lives and protect property. Protecting the nation's ability to provide high-quality operational weather data and accurate weather forecasts requires limiting interference in the passive microwave spectrum bands adjoining 24, 50, and 90 gigahertz. The 24 gigahertz band is the only spectral band with high sensitivity to water vapor and low sensitivity to clouds, and it contributes to multispectral analysis of the physical characteristics of the Earth's surface, such as sea ice, snow, soil moisture, and vegetation state, which are also required for weather prediction. This unique spectral band is of very high importance to operational weather prediction and is critically important for providing advanced warning of hazardous weather events. The laws of physics dictate these passive frequency bands. They're a gift of nature, and therefore there is no alternative other than protection. This is why the public, private, and academic sectors of the meteorological community are deeply concerned over increasing encroachment on weather-related radio frequency bands and are urging the FCC and other bodies to recognize the need for adequate protection and mitigation efforts against the loss and shared use of this critical spectrum for observing the Earth system. This threat is coming during a period when our country is facing significant increases in billion-dollar weather disaster events. Earth observations are required for weather forecasting, studies of climate change, for transportation, renewable energy, agricultural and food security, wildfire management, drought prediction, supply chain management, homeland security and defense, and many more uses. More than 90% of the Earth's observations used for weather modeling originate from satellites. A significant fraction of the improved forecast skill over the last 30 years is due to remote sensing of temperature and water vapor. Preliminary studies have indicated that the proliferation of terrestrial 5G systems using 24 gigahertz frequencies will make remotely sensed atmospheric data less accurate or even unusable, unless 5G is rigorously implemented in a manner that protects the adjacent Earth exploration satellite service spectrum. At a time of increasing weather hazard vulnerability due to climate change and demographic shifts, it's an imperative that critical Earth observations be protected from interference. Investments in observational sensitivity studies must be done to fully flesh out the scope of the impacts. We know forecast skill will be reduced overall, but we need to know more about the impacts and forecast skill for specific phenomena such as tornadoes, floods, derechos, droughts, hurricane track and intensity, wildfire risk, and others. The concerns of the weather enterprise and earth sciences community need to be heard and taken seriously, as the impact of contaminated or lost Earth observing data could be catastrophic for weather prediction and those that rely on accurate warnings and advisories. Before I conclude, I would like to thank you for advancing HR 2225, the NSF for the Future Act, through passage in the House. This is an important piece of legislation at an important time for this country. Thank you again for your leadership and for giving me the opportunity to testify before this committee.
Thank you so very much. Our next witness is Ms. Manner.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and committee members, thank you for inviting me today. My name is Jennifer Manner, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Regulatory Affairs at EchoStar Corporation and Hughes Network Systems. It is my honor to discuss spectrum management during this momentous time in our telecommunications history. However, for the U.S. to continue its leadership, it must make appropriate reforms in its domestic and international spectrum management process. This is critical to private companies such as EchoStar Hughes, a global leader in broadband and narrowband satellite services, as well as U.S. government users. I was a member of the Commerce Department's FACA on spectrum management called the CSMAC. The CSMAC prepared a report that recognized that the U.S. spectrum management approach does not effectively serve the needs of the stakeholder community and would benefit from reform. We made 3 categories of recommendations. 1, standing up a new agency, unifying U.S. spectrum management decision-making. 2, repurposing either of the existing spectrum management agencies with broader jurisdiction over spectrum governance. And 3, reforms that could stand on their own. Legislation is required for either of the first 2 options, but option 3's proposals can be acted without legislation and primarily focused on revising the NTIA FCC MOU on spectrum coordination. Specifically, we recommended, first, increasing meetings of the agency's principals and staff to improve communications and planning. 2, having definitive notice periods for coordinating items. 3, including coordination of World Radio Communications Conferences, or WARCs, and international standards issues. 4, establishing an interagency working group on spectrum initiatives and spectrum planning. 5, holding annually a public workshop on spectrum research and coordination. And 6, that the agency should work together to gather increased information on spectrum demand, spectrum utilization, and sharing mechanisms. I would also personally make the following recommendations. Increase the technical staff at the FCC and NTIA, and 2, take a broader and more balanced approach to spectrum management, considering both the public interest as determined by the FCC and the national interest standard determined by executive branch agencies. Turning to the international side, there is a more severe shortage of technical agency staff at the FCC, NTIA, and the State Department. State Department, the policy lead internationally, has traditionally served the role of decision maker if the FCC and NTIA disagree on a U.S. position for a meeting at the ITU, the UN's organization for telecom and spectrum. This is an important role because state has a sense of the broad issues incumbent in the national interests. But state cannot mediate on a technical issue if it lacks engineering expertise. If the U.S. is to lead in these international settings, Congress should consider increasing appropriations for full-time engineer employees and travel budgets for all agencies with staff attending ITU meetings. When I attended my first work in 1995, U.S. leadership at the ITU was clear. However, other countries have gained influence in an increasingly competitive global telecommunications market. The U.S. must up its game to be successful by taking the following actions. 1, develop a balanced approach to international spectrum management issues, especially at the WARC. The FCC, NTIA, and the State Department must coordinate on U.S. positions with private sector input as appropriate. This will enable more effective operation of the U.S. ITU delegations, ensure greater success internationally of the U.S. 2, agency decision-making must be based on the public and national interests and achieve the balance of commercial and governmental interests that has made the U.S. the world leader in telecom. 3, train technical agency staff with the diplomatic skills to lead U.S. delegations to international meetings and act as issue spokespeople to facilitate U.S. leadership and success at the ITU. In closing, as you consider next steps, I urge you to consider the recommendations of CSMAC and those I propose. Currently, the U.S. approach results in favoring 5G terrestrial technology over other commercial services and critical federal users. The recommendations I discussed today will greatly assist the spectrum management process. To lead in the spectrum arena, the U.S. and the international and domestic process must be driven by a more collaborative interagency process that starts with agreed goals and spectrum sharing metrics. U.S. positions should seek outcomes consistent with a balanced national interest. Finally, there is a need for periodic review of spectrum governance more than once every 100 years. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the invitation to testify before the committee today, and I look forward to the committee's questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, we will begin our first round of questions. The chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. I have 2 letters to be entered into the hearing record. One is from the American Weather and Climate Industry Association, the Trade Association for Weather Professionals. The other is a joint message from the American Geophysical Union and the American Meteorological Society and the National Weather Association. These groups are dedicated to ensuring the protection of environmental satellites and other weather observation technologies. And without objection, so ordered. Many science stakeholders have pointed out that for the 24 gigahertz process, it is difficult to even get to the table, to even become aware of what was at stake, because the 24 gigahertz proceedings was folded into a much larger spectrum frontier proposal, which covered many other bands. Even the lawyers need lawyers to help them understand exactly what is going on in some of these mega proceedings. Mr. Mahoney, do you believe that the most weather and climate scientists who depend on the 23.6 GHz bands have the understanding of the FCC public comment process and how best to weigh in on these proceedings?
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. Unfortunately, no, I don't think the scientific community is well aware of the details of these proceedings. Most scientists do keep track of their data sources and their technical specifications, their quality metrics and availability. And the scientific community also tracks research and development activities when anticipating new data sets. But the FCC process is very complex and confusing for the scientific community. And most scientists do not have the resources available to them or advocates for such a process. So I think it's very clear that the scientific community needs to be engaged, particularly with Earth system science observational data sets that are critical for research and operations are threatened, and that new engagement mechanisms need to be developed.
Thank you. Do you feel that the FCC could do more meaningful outreach to the scientific community about the proceedings that directly impact the science community? And what specifically should FCC do?
Well, I strongly believe that the FCC should be much more proactive engaging the scientific community when considering the sharing of spectrum for Earth science-related matters. The FCC should really develop mechanisms to notify and educate the scientific community by working with federal agencies and their stakeholders, university representatives, not-for-profits, and scientific associations, some of them which you just mentioned in the letters that were submitted. A lot more agencies depend on Earth system data than just NASA and NOAA. Other agencies need to be at the table, including DOD, the USGS, the USDA, Department of Interior, National Science Foundation, and DOE, just to name a few. And then there's the other parts of the scientific community, including, as you mentioned earlier, the American Meteorological Society, the American Geophysical Union, AAAS, National Academy of Sciences. There's the American Weather and Climate Industry Association, National Weather Association, University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, Association of American Universities. I can go on, but the number of dependents on Earth system observations is very, very large. And they absolutely need to be more involved in understanding and being actively participating in the FCC proceedings.
Thank you. Ms. Manor, or any other witness who would like to weigh in? While I understand that the FCC does have a specific function to do outreach to the American Indian community, should there be a function to do targeted outreach to the scientific community?
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for your question. I think that's a very good proposal. It is not currently within the mandate of the FCC. They right now work through the IRAC and NTIA, but I think in situations like this, it would be an appropriate role for the FCC if they have the staffing and are able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other witness would like to comment?
Chairwoman Johnson, I would just note that I believe that there is an opportunity for the telecommunications industry as they go before the FCC to do that coordination with the academic community ahead of time. I think that creating a good, strong dialogue starts with conversations early on in the process, and that's when industry is considering the prospective use. Thank you.
Thank you. NOAA has a growing focus on enduring equity and weather information across the U.S., and this is important for the urban areas where numerous billion-dollar extreme weather disasters have threatened cities like Houston, New York in recent years. And these events have outsized the impact of communities of color. Dr. Girth, would you like to comment on that? Since 5G deployment will be the most concentrated in urban areas, does that mean that interference with passive sensors would negatively impact urban forecasts more acutely?
Chairwoman Johnson, thank you for that question. There's many, many Americans that live along America's coasts and in urban areas, and it's certainly not lost on me during the heat waves of this summer how many Americans are struggling in urban areas, potentially without air conditioning and accommodations as such. It's very difficult to know for certain exactly how 5G interference would lead to changes in predictability for different parts of the United States, and that's something that we certainly want to study. It is true, however, though, that observations over land are generally more powerful in advancing numerical weather simulations of storms that may be over the ocean, moving toward land and helping with evacuations and forecasts preceding those prospective landfalls. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would note to the witnesses that many of the questions we ask in these hearings come at the similar points from different directions, and that's our effort to build a case to drive the decision-making process. So first, Mr. Mahoney, in your testimony, you state that weather data from satellites is the key reason for better weather model predictions. And these improvements have saved lives, protected property, whether from tornadoes or hurricanes or other severe weather. And it's also important in drought predictions. And coming from Oklahoma, where we deal with virtually almost all of those issues, I am very appreciative of that. In your view, and if you could expand even more, in your view, how can science and this critical national asset better inform spectrum allocation policy?
Well, you're correct in noting that severe weather is of great concern to a large part of the United States. The United States has more severe weather in its midsection than almost any other continent. The data, temperature and water vapor data from the passive spectrum is absolutely critical for severe weather prediction. Those data are assimilated into numerical weather prediction models, and the sensitivity of the data, especially at 24 gigahertz, towards water vapor near the surface where that frequency can see through the clouds, provides atmospheric sounding information that can make or break a forecast from being clear all day to having absolutely severe thunderstorms and even tornadoes. So the loss of the temporal and spatial resolution of the data that are provided from these remotely sensed satellite systems really will degrade severe weather prediction in many cases. Of course, there are days when it's very dry and very stable, and the sensitivity of the forecast is not as high for these type of data sets, but on many days, especially in the spring and summer period, data from these remote sensed units at 24 gigahertz is absolutely critical for the forecast.
Continuing with you, Mr. Mahoney, how can the allocation process adopt a do no harm posture, which is your words, that requires evidence these commercial activities do not disrupt critical weather and Earth observations? Do no harm.
Well, until we really have a mechanism in place and the resources in place to do substantial studies, observation sensitivity experiments, in which we can look at the impact of interference at different levels with different configurations of the 5G network, it's going to be hard to pinpoint exactly what the forecast impact is going to be on any particular extreme weather phenomena. So what needs to occur is first do no harm until we have a much better idea of what the impacts could be and how much interference may be tolerated, if any. So at this point, most of the studies that have been done have been pretty broad data denial experiments or simplified interference experiments, and their results have been generalized to the general forecasting process. But a lot more needs to be done to really understand the specific impact of interference on very particular forecasts for severe weather.
Mr. Luber, as I mentioned in my opening statement, farmers who use GPS to engage in precision agriculture rely on clear spectrum frequencies. We continue to see concerns that some of these commercial telecom services may be too powerful for GPS to be received accurately. In your opinion, would a degraded GPS signal for farming lead to a reduction in crop productivity? And along that line, are there ways to mitigate this interference?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. The GPS issue and the interference in frequencies associated with that, as well as associated with the weather community, have been discussed for quite some time. Yes, I believe that there have been a great number of studies of concern that those GPS receivers could be impacted, especially in applications of precision farming as well as in space. I think the weather community, though, has a different aspect to it, something in addition to the licensing that was done in April of 2020, that was only 75% of the spectrum that the requester desired. And one portion of that would impact the dissemination of weather, water, and wildfire sensors that are necessary, as well as dissemination and rebroadcast of some of the imagery that Dr. Girth talked about.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Chair Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas, for holding this important hearing. And thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. The world around us is evolving at a rapid pace. The deployment of 5G technology and next generation wireless service is undoubtedly going to change the way we live. This is an exciting prospect, but to build the interconnected world of the future, large swaths of spectrum will be required. As we have heard from our witnesses today, radio frequencies such as the 23.8 gigahertz band used for Earth and space science applications are vitally important, not just for scientists and federal agencies, but for the protection of the public and our nation's economy. We know the damages of climate change are severe and that they are costly. If we were to lose this critical spectrum for observing the Earth system, the ability to understand our climate and predict increasingly prevalent and devastating natural disasters would be tragically diminished. So, Mr. Mahoney, you emphasized in your testimony that virtually every sector of the U.S. economy is weather sensitive and that any degradation of Earth observation data will have significant negative financial and safety impacts. Can you explain how protecting spectrum for Earth-observing satellites has broad economic implications for everyday Americans, for our businesses, and our governments at all levels?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think there's underappreciation within our society of the dependency on weather prediction information that's used by individuals every day to decide very simple things, from what to wear, how to send your kids off to school, whether or not to take a trip. But there are major industries such as aviation that depend on very accurate weather forecasts to avoid wind shear and turbulence and icing, ground de-icing, snowstorms. The routing of aircraft around the country is highly dependent on wind speeds and temperature, so that the aircraft will only need to tanker or hold enough fuel to get from point to point and have enough reserves. The subtleties in the forecast for certain ceiling and visibility, for example, at airports, will determine whether an airport can operate at full capacity or partial capacity, or whether aircraft have to be sent to other airports if severe weather is likely. So very subtle decisions for the aviation industry are made every day, resulting in tens of millions of dollars of efficiencies and safety. You look at agriculture, where growing degree days, measurement for crop models, all kind of tie into decisions regarding seed selection and harvesting time and pest control and the application of fertilizers as such. Weather information in very, very fine detail is utilized to optimize those operations. Renewable energy is extremely sensitive to weather. Wind energy requires information for wind shear and turbulence and wind speed very close to the ground. Solar energy requires information on clouds and aerosols and humidity to determine how much solar radiation is going to be converted to solar energy. I can go on and on, but the number of industries that are dependent on weather are in the tens of billions of dollars, and 3.4% of the US GDP is sensitive to weather. And a lot of weather decisions are made when just fractions of a degree are at stake. So remote sensing of the Earth and at the temporal and spatial scales that we get from these passive remote satellite systems is absolutely critical. We need to see the entire Earth to make accurate weather predictions.
I thank you for that. And Dr. Girth, perhaps you can, other than economic impacts, perhaps you could tell us about the ways in which spectrum interference would hamper our ability to prepare for and respond to climate change.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Representative Tonko. We need a very long record of the atmosphere at multiple levels. So we're not just talking about the surface, we're talking about the full depth of the atmosphere, even above where the planes fly, to understand how our climate is changing and where the climate is changing the most. Microwave is very important in that sense because microwaves can traverse through the clouds, so we can get a whole of atmosphere approach when we use microwave data. Microwave observations are now about 40 years old. We've had satellites dating back into the 1970s. So continuing that without interference is critical to assessing how our climate is changing and where it is changing the fastest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Johnson, for holding this hearing. Question to all the witnesses. We are discussing the redress options for government agencies that they have if their missions are disrupted by FCC action. But what about the private sector? What options exist for the private sector if their businesses, farms, or ranches, or whatever are hurt as a result of spectrum interference?
Congressman Posey, thank you for that question. The private sector would have to appreciate the spectrum role in what was impacting their particular use of the weather information and would have to appreciate that the Federal Communications had some kind of a public process. That might be a stretch too far for the average user to tie those events together. Perhaps an oversimplification, but the FCC process is somewhat like someone placing technical information on a sign on a given street corner for a particular period of time. And you have to be astute enough to understand where the street corner is and be watching for that information or pay someone to do so. And for the average individual, that's a very difficult thing.
Representative Posey, this Andrew from GAO. One of the recourses that they would have would be to go to the FCC. Of course, it would depend on whether it was licensed or unlicensed spectrum that was at issue here. If they had a particular license and it was being interfered with, that's FCC's job, is to try to ensure that these license holders don't interfere with one another. But to Mr. Lubar's point, if it's sort of unlicensed spectrum being used, they would have to sort of understand exactly where that interference might be coming from, which might be quite difficult for them to do.
Representative, just to add in, the other thing is there is a lot of efforts between commercial entities to try and resolve interference. So if we know we're getting interference and we can trace where it's coming to, we'll work directly with the interferer. So there's areas, for sophisticated users, licensees in particular, where you don't have to go to the FCC. You're oftentimes able to work that out between the two licensees.
And if I might add in, the one example of poor communication with the private sector was the 1675, 1680 band, and that affects the downlink of data from the GO satellite station. All of the focus was on ensuring that the NOAA ground stations were protected with blackout zones. However, the private sector has receivers all over the country in which they utilize direct data receipts to minimize any delays in providing services and warnings. And they were almost completely left out of the discussion on solutions, and that can't take place going forward.
Thank you. In the letter that Chairwoman Johnson entered into the record, the GPS Innovation Alliance states that, quote, GPS is vital to national and economic security and relied upon by numerous industries, including aviation, agriculture, automotive, construction, electricity, finance, public safety, and transportation, close quote. The Alliance concludes that through a truly shared decision-making process, no single agency would have exclusive authority over the spectrum matters, where both commercial and federal users were both involved at the same time. Does the FCC's authorization of the deployment of a nationwide 5G terrestrial wireless network demonstrate that the process needs reform? And could 5G networks in certain spectrum bands make our GPS system less accurate? Anyone care to pick up on that?
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber.
You want to go?
Oops, sorry. Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. We just had a record-breaking heat wave across the Pacific Northwest just last month, and it was one of the deadliest natural disasters in Oregon. And my heart goes out to the families of 116 Oregonians who lost their lives and many more in the region. And as temperatures surged to unprecedented triple digits, emergency managers and first responders, they needed accurate, reliable weather data. Unfortunately, we know that extreme weather events like the dangerous heat dome and the early wildfires across our state right now are only expected to become more frequent and more intense because of the climate crisis. So accurate weather forecasting will continue to be essential, especially for our frontline communities. Dr. Girth, I appreciate your testimony. You acknowledged the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act, which I was pleased to co-lead with Ranking Member Lucas. As we crafted the bill, we focused on several issues that you highlighted today, including the importance of telecommunications industry partnering with Weather Enterprise to deliver informative, accurate messages to our communities. So there is a requirement in the weather bill for observing system simulation experiments in connection with buying or leasing a new satellite. And you suggest expanding those provisions and having NOAA and NASA regularly audit the use of spectrum. So how would this help to integrate the best available science into our decision-making on the spectrum issue?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Representative. And yes, I am watching what's going on in Oregon this summer as well, and my hearts go out to Oregonians that have been affected by the heat and the fires out there. With regards to the Weather Act and expanding the directive to conduct more observing system experiments, the key thing there is the FCC timelines. These notices of proposed rulemaking come up very quickly, and it is far, far shorter than the time it takes to conduct quality peer-reviewed science. Since the 23.8 gigahertz issue has come onto the scene, we're just now starting to get some of that peer-reviewed literature out of the academic community to kind of inform what the impacts would be, and we have a lot more work to do in that. So by having NOAA and NASA be proactive and really doing a audit of all of their spectrum holdings, if you will, spectrum uses every 5 years or so, there will always be a relatively recent study that can be pulled off, and our private sector telecommunications industry can review that and see what the risks are. And also we'll be able to know from doing that what pieces of the spectrum are more valuable than others. There's 22 bands in the ATMS, the Advanced Technology Microwave Sounder, that NOAA currently operates. We know that all those bands are valuable, but some of them are particularly valuable compared to others. And that's what we need to be very aware of. And by NOAA, as their modeling systems are upgraded, by continuing to present the industry with that knowledge, can really assure that we have a baseline for decision-making moving forward.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Guth. And Mr. Mahoney, in your testimony, you acknowledged the challenges with interference in the specific radio frequencies just below 24 gigahertz, where substitution is not possible just because of the laws of physics. So what further research and development is needed to help address that interference, as well as interference in other frequencies? And what lessons can we learn from the challenges around 24 gigahertz, and how can we proactively apply those lessons to other spectrum bands?
Well, Doctor, thank you very much for the question. And Dr. Guth just mentioned a bit about the type of studies that need to be done and the timelines for those studies. The way data are assimilated into models makes it a challenge to do global reforecast. There are a lot of compute resources that are required, and a lot of sensitivity studies, as I mentioned earlier, focused on specific phenomena. It's easier to do studies, although it still takes sufficient time and computing resources to look at the general impacts of interference on a general forecast, getting the weather patterns globally generally right. But to really focus in and do data denial experiments or sensitivity experiments focused on individual extreme phenomena will take even more time. The data assimilation process is a bit complicated. And one thing we need to know up front in doing these type of sensitivity experiments is exactly what assumptions to make about the 5G network. You know, how many towers, what is their geographical distribution, what are the power levels, et cetera. And it's very challenging to get the initial state correct for a capability that has yet to be deployed.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber.
Let me tell you up front, I need about 10 minutes, but I'll try to cut it short. Let me start with you, Mr. Von Aw. You said in your remarks, and I was trying to list all the alphabet soup agencies, NOAA, NASA, FCC, NIST. They didn't agree. There was no mechanism to come to an agreement. And somebody said, I think we had to review it. We reviewed it every 100 years. My question to you, Mr. Von Aw, is shouldn't Congress be that mechanism? And of course, very biased, or shouldn't the Science Committee have a lot of input in that?
Thank you for that question, Representative Weber. Yes, certainly the NTIA FCC MOU has not been updated in over 20 years, nor has the general guidance document that guided the preparatory work for the World Radio Conference. This is certainly something that would be within Congress's purview to direct the agencies to update that memorandum or to make changes to it, and we've made recommendations to the agencies to do so. And certainly where there are competing priorities for spectrum, the administration and Congress are the places where those decisions get made.
Well, thank you. I would argue that that national defense is the number one purview of Congress per the Constitution. We want to keep Americans safe, and with enemies threatening to weaponize space, that our space capabilities should be first and foremost. So I guess I'll go to a second question and leave it open for the panel. Well, Ms. Manner will ask you this. Decisions at the FCC. Is it your opinion that they bias terrestrial communication services over space-based or satellite communications?
Thank you for the question. As I noted in my testimony, at this point in time on spectrum issues, we do find a bias based on economic rationale as opposed to other rationale. And I'll give you an example. I think the millimeter wave bands is a very good example. Chairwoman Rosenworcel from the FCC the other day just said with regard to the millimeter wave bands that if the 5G industry just had to rely on those bands, we would have a bigger digital divide than we do today. One of the other frequency bands that was at issue during the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding was a very important band to the commercial industry, 27.5 to 28.35 gigahertz, where the satellite industry operates their gateway earth stations. The FCC severely curtailed our use despite a very, very heavy turnout on us explaining that we needed this harmonized spectrum. And yet, just the other day, we heard from the FCC chairwoman that perhaps the spectrum isn't as important to 5G. It's in the same proceeding as the 24 gigahertz. So yes, I have been seeing a bias on that.
So I would thank you for that. I would say, look, we need to have a lot of those agencies come together, and whether it's overseen by a committee put together, a task force of the Science Committee, we need the Department of Defense. Obviously, we need space folks involved. We need transportation people involved because there's a move to, as y'all know, use some of the bandwidth for traffic signals and stuff of that nature. But let me jump up here real quick. If some of y'all maybe not know, I've been around a long time. I had my first cell phone in 1984. It was a huge thing mounted in my truck in the air conditioning business. GSM or CDMA were the two types of cell phone signals that I remember, and I guess they're still prevalent today. Do y'all know that? Anyone know that for a fact?
They are being replaced over time, so not today so much. We're looking at LTE and then the 3GPP standards going forward.
So if we got those together, I've often thought this because, you could never buy a cell phone and it transport from one carrier, one provider to the other, which I thought was by design, quite frankly. But nonetheless, if we got all of those carrier signals together, would that save bandwidth?
I think it's two different issues. That's really a standards issue. So I think the good news is that 3G, we now are working through a single standards organization, 3GPP, primarily to develop 5G and beyond standards, and it's becoming a more technology neutral approach. But because of the great needs of spectrum or the claims of spectrum, unfortunately, that's where we're having demand issues. So it's not a standard issue today. I think it's a spectrum needs issue and a spectrum assignment allocation issue. Thank you. Okay,
well, thank you for that. I'm going to yield back, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ross.
Needed to unmute. Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for having this very important and timely hearing, and thanks to the panelists for joining us. I'm from North Carolina, and we have kind of both ends of this conversation going on. So we have sea levels that have risen more than a foot on the coast in the span of 70 years, and we have extreme weather events, frequently because of hurricanes and other things that come up. As a matter of fact, we're now considered winter peaking because the effects of ice storms on our energy levels. And I'm deeply concerned about climate change and want to safeguard our climate scientists' ability to conduct their important research without interference. My district also includes North Carolina State University, which is one of the nation's largest mechanical and aerospace engineering departments and is conducting groundbreaking research on the convergence of 5G technology and autonomous drones. And just last week, the Triangle area where I'm from received an Innovation Zone designation from the FCC intended to spur the development and integration of 5G network technologies and open radio access networks. So suffice it to say, this topic is extremely important to the constituents, researchers, and universities in my district in North Carolina. And my first question is for Dr. Girth and Mr. Mahoney. It's become a given in the discussions on Capitol Hill and in the business community that the value of deploying 5G to the economy is very high. But I'm concerned that we haven't been able to quantify and value weather forecasting to save lives and property. So how can valuations of weather forecasting be better considered and balanced in the spectrum regulatory process?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Representative Ross. I think there's several ways to do it, one of which is to look at how predictability of weather phenomena changes over time. So, for example, let's take hurricanes. Over time, we've been able to use, and I'm just talking about the last 15 years or so, use weather satellites to really reduce what's called the cone of uncertainty, where the center of the storm is going to go, where the highest impacts are going to be. We can then take that information from our numerical models and then estimate what the costs of evacuating an area would be, because we know that evacuations have significant costs. And by that advanced warning, we can then give an actual value to the data that's coming from the satellites and how it's improving the weather forecast. So I certainly think that with NOAA routinely conducting studies about the value of the spectrum that's used on the weather satellites and how the models are evolving and their skill, we can really make a very concise case about exactly how much in terms of taxpayer resources are being saved by having those capabilities in this country. Thank you.
Mr. Mahoney, if you have something briefly to add, that'd be great. But I do have a question for Ms. Manor I want to get in the next minute.
I'll just say very briefly, the American Meteorological Society has done and is working on studies to really understand the impacts of weather, water, and climate prediction to the U.S. economy. And as I mentioned earlier and in my testimony, the U.S. economy is sensitive to weather variability in the tune of about $600 billion. But more needs to be done.
Thank you. We need to get that into the conversation. For Ms. Manor, in your testimony, you state that the FCC allocates spectrum according to public interest rather than national interest, a decision that sometimes values the short-term needs of the public over solving long-term systemic issues. What can Congress do to ensure that agencies like the FCC consider national interests, things like climate and weather forecasting when they do their work?
So thank you. So the public interest is actually the standard in the Communications Act of 1934. So to change that for the FCC would require a legislative change. But I do think through the improved coordination under the MOU, which is something we're urging, and I think is very important, as well as the international process, which is where a lot of the issues that we've had come up on things like 24 gigahertz. If you could have an agency like the State Department act as the arbiter, they could take into account the broader national interest, which we do think is important. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Beard.
My turn. Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Lucas. And I appreciate all the witnesses being here today and having your expertise share with us some of the direction that we might take. So I think this is an important hearing. I guess I'm going to start with Mr. Lubart. We have a finite resource in the amount of spectrum that we have. In my observation, And yet we're adding more and more wireless applications, and they come online. So we're going to need to allocate more spectrum to serve these applications because that need is only going to grow. So from your perspective and your knowledge and experience, what are some of the technologies or strategies that either currently exist or could be developed to mitigate the demand for spectrum and solve the interference concerns that we're currently discussing?
Thank you, Congressman Baird. That is a certainly complex question. If we focus on this particular problem of interference into the passive bands, the real important issue is to be able to identify that these bands are being contaminated. And there really are only two methods, in my opinion, to do that. That you could place some type of a scientific package on the satellite gathering the data, and that device would identify the interference contamination, do some significant computation on the spacecraft, and flag that data so that it doesn't contaminate the downstream weather process. But I think in addition to that, you need to survey the RF environment. You know, around these passive bands, it's a very, very difficult thing to make those kind of measurements. And the real complexity involved is if signals are of such a low level that they contaminate the data, but they don't contaminate it enough that you could tell. That's a very dangerous situation because then that data could be incorporated into the weather models and tools.
Well, thank you for that. And if I might continue on in that same vein, do you think that commercial radio spectrum mapping satellites, such as the Hawkeye 360, could they be used to detect interference and improve the weather dating model?
The Hawkeye 360 system, which I'm familiar with, is limited to particular bands and particular applications. It would not include the bands in the so-called high band that we're talking about in this gigahertz range. It's certainly not in the design they have. It is a very useful system, though, for determining ADS-B and other type signals in bands below that.
Well, thank you. Appreciate your input and insight. Ms. Manner, I'm going to move to you. The FCC Chairwoman, Jessica Rosen-Worcel, recently stated that it was a mistake to focus on the millimeter wave spectrum band for 5G auctions, which includes the 24G and the gigahertz. She would like the FCC to pivot to mid-band spectrum, which many regard as the sweet spot for connectivity and the key to access in rural areas. And since I come from a rural area, that's extremely important to me. So I would just appreciate your perspective on the millimeter wave spectrum versus the mid-range.
Certainly, and thank you for the question. I would say that the millimeter wave spectrum, as I mentioned just earlier, we fought very hard against it being limiting the use of commercial satellite because we, of course, do provide service to rural areas like your district. Whether it's our system or SpaceX or OneWeb or choose your favorite Viasat, choose your favorite satellite system. And it has very poor propagation characteristics for the most part for commercial communications because it's very high up. So the mid-band certainly has better propagation characteristics for terrestrial services. So that does allow, broader communications, wider bandwidth. So certainly can help. I'm still of the view that there are certain places in this country where it's just not going to be economical to serve terrestrially, and you're going to have to rely on satellite. And I think the good news on that is with systems like ours and others who are having higher frequency bands, who are having higher speeds and lower latency, I think you're going to see better service. But there has to be spectrum to enable commercial satellite operators as well as terrestrial. So thank you for the question.
Well, thank you very much for that response. And I really appreciate the optimism about maybe we could solve some of these rural, remote area problems. And so with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this very timely hearing on some critical questions facing the rollout of 5G and the new technologies and the implications they may have for our scientific and research communities and enterprises. The FCC auctioned the 24 gigahertz band in May 2019 under a certain set of rules. And then in December that year, the World Radio Conference parties agreed to apply more restrictive emission limits across the globe. The FCC has a comment period open now on the rulemaking that would conform the US rules to the ones we agreed to with foreign governments. But the US goes to the World Radio Conferences and negotiates with other governments because we are a signatory to the Constitution of the International Telecommunication Union. And as we all have talked about, and we know, weather is a global phenomenon. It does not stop at the border. So, Ms. Manner, with that prelude, and anyone else who cares to respond, are you aware of any instances of when the FCC did not follow the ITU spectrum regulations that had a global impact? And as more 5G hardware gets deployed, what is being done now to monitor interference in the 24 gigahertz band?
So thank you for the question. I can certainly focus on the first part. I'm not aware of an answer to the second. I'm not an expert on 24, but I am not personally aware. But what the FCC did with 24 gigahertz is they actually did not follow the global requirements. They've chosen as a country, which is something we're allowed to do, to take a different approach. And as long as it doesn't cause interference to other countries' communications, it's allowed. But there's a bigger repercussion, and that's the lack of the ability to harmonize, and the fact that these services are going to be impacted in the United States, just like we've seen with other satellite services, our own. When I was talking about 28 gigahertz, that's of concern. So you do have the interference potential, of course, because we are doing something differently, but you also have a broader issue, which is you're not able to take advantage of the global or regional nature of satellite systems. And that's a growing concern and something that we're seeing neglected by the FCC in its decision-making time and time again. Thank you.
Congresswoman, I could add to that if you would.
Please.
I believe that the 24 gigahertz and the other bands in this region, certainly as you've heard, are contributing to a global model for weather. And the way weather information is sensed, all the satellites in the various nations share that under the terms of the World Meteorological Organization. And so contamination to this band not only affects our weather, but affects the weather that other countries gather information. And conversely, as we use their data, it's also potentially contaminated. And so I think that you have to look at that case in the overall picture of it is a larger problem. I agree with Ms. Manner that an administration is allowed to do what they can to vary from the ITU rules as long as it doesn't impact another administration that is following those rules. But in this particular case, the Europeans, for example, they took the ITU limits and they decided to enforce the split level of requirement that the rules said would get more stringent in 2027, September 2027, and move it up to January 2024. Now, I'm not going to comment one way or the other on whether I think that was something that the industry could comply with. But the fact now that you would have one standard in Europe where all the satellites, American and foreign, are gathering that information, as well as a different standard than in the Americas, or at least in the United States, you have to ask yourself, what will that do to the information in that 4-year period?
Thank you. And Mr. Lubar, as long as I have you, to what extent do Earth-observing satellites use any approaches on orbit to mitigate radio interference before the data are sent down to the ground? And is there anything being done that can improve the capabilities as part of addressing radio interference?
Thank you for that question. As I alluded to earlier, on this passive band contamination, there really is no way to detect it unless you have a device in space. The ideal way, anyway, to detect it is to add a device in space to the operational satellites. Now, there is no funding at the moment for a system that has been preliminarily designed on the Joint Polar Satellite System. And I think time is of the essence to provide that funding to ensure that they make it in time for the upcoming launches. So that's one way. but that only flags the data. And then, of course, there's money and resources needed to take that flag and do something with it on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Lubar. I'm out of time and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Lucas for pulling this together. Very important conversation. I've got a couple top-level questions and then some technical questions that I'd like to get to. So if we can make the answers short, that would be ideal. Does anyone on this panel know where the $2 billion of proceeds from the auctions goes to? Does it go directly to the Treasury and then not reinvested into either techniques or characterization efforts that some of you have outlined?
Yeah, Representative Garcia, I can answer that. It does go to the Treasury. To keep
okay,
it short.
So we don't get any sort of cut of that or any rake on the tape there from the auctions that actually feeds back into helping you guys manage the challenges here at all, from what you can tell?
No, sir.
Okay, I would submit that that's a weakness and probably something that we as a team should look at and how to improve on. From a technical perspective, I think, Mr. Girth, you mentioned ATMS on JPSS-1. I believe it's the same system that's going up on JPSS-2 next September launch. That, as you mentioned, is a 22-channel system. The first channel is right at 23.8 gigahertz, which is obviously in the heart of the envelope for what we're talking about here. Have we characterized the impact of some of the noise or jamming effects that the auction has had on channel 1 of ATMS yet on JPSS-1?
Not to my knowledge, because as has been previously mentioned, the FCC is still finalizing the rules for adjacent interference.
How long would it be before we start seeing that feedback and can start characterizing the impact? Is it a year, 5 years, or just a couple of months?
I don't have a good idea of how long that would take. It would probably depend on how quickly the networks are rolled out.
Okay. I would submit that this is a second weakness. I think this same ATMS system, still passive with 22 channels, is designed for JPSS-3 as well. So I think as we look at these, we've got to look at how do we evolve these technologies and make them a little more agile on the ground before they get up into space. And I would also suggest that working with some of the defense labs, the classified programs on electronic protection techniques, and incorporating that into some of these space systems is absolutely critical as well. That can be done and imported, I think, at an unclassified level once it's done, and just turn it into a black box. But there's labs like NRL, Sandia that are working interesting solutions to a lot of these noise level floors that you're talking about. And then, Mr. Mahoney, just a technical question as well. Why passive? Why not use L-band, which is typically used for clear air turbulence, or S-band or X-band, which are also good for weather? I know C-band's an optimal range as well, right? The 48 gigahertz. Why? Help me out. I'm an RF guy, but I was an X-band kind of guy in a prior life. Why the passive side of this at this frequency range versus an active, X-band or C-band? Why K-band and why passive?
Well, I'm not able to answer your question directly in terms of some of the alternatives. I can only speak to the uniqueness of the passive bands and the fact that there are these distinct bands that are able to be observed, where the temperature and humidity soundings can be made just by moving the frequency off the center point for these passive bands. And so you can get a sounding of the atmosphere, which is absolutely critical for weather forecasting. Moving into other bands may not have, you'll be outside of the passive bands or the bands you can actually see the atmosphere, and it may be more transparent than necessary to receive the data back at the quality you need. It may be better for Jordan to respond to the details of the different frequencies.
And Jordan, I'll defer to you here for the last.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would just note that, again, we're talking about the collection of very specific atmospheric data, and that is where we can collect that is driven by the physics of the molecules. So there are other bands out there, for example, water vapor sensing, which is a key input for our numerical models. and there has to be an existing allocation there. It's not like the weather community can go say, well, there's water vapor observations over here, but if it's almost certainly already allocated for some other use. So we have to be very careful about that. Yep.
Okay, thank you. And just in the last couple of seconds, I will say I don't think we as a nation should be cooperating with China in our space endeavors, either on the commercial or defense side. But I will say we do need some sort of nexus and coordinating efforts in terms of bandwidth allocation and this RF spectrum management question. Otherwise, these guys are just going to come into our neighborhoods that the chairwoman eloquently described and wreak havoc on us. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stansberry.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member, for convening today's important panel. I think it's been said already, but I'll repeat, from the heat waves in the Northwest to the large-scale fires and drought across the West, including in my home state of New Mexico, climate change is already impacting communities across the United States. We can see these impacts in increased frequency of extreme weather events and their disproportionate impacts to our communities, including, of course, property damage and the tragic and preventable loss of life. We need accurate weather forecasting and effective data gathering to predict these weather events and plan for and respond to the impacts of climate change. As we continue to invest in new technologies, including those that require the use of these spectrum bands and work to increase their accessibility, we cannot risk putting our communities in danger by overcrowding or opening spectrum bands that negatively impact our ability to forecast weather and other data collection. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to continue examining how to improve federal coordination with the spectrum auction process and better involve our scientific, governmental, and community stakeholders in the process and conversation. And Madam Chairwoman, my question is actually for Mr. Mahoney and possibly Mr. Lubar. We've heard today that interference in the 23.6 gigahertz band could threaten data sources we need for day-to-day weather forecasting, Earth observing systems, and understanding and making predictions on long-term climate trends. Communities across the U.S., including in New Mexico, are experiencing significant impacts, especially from climate change in our water systems, including reductions in snowpack and runoff and increasingly irregular precipitation patterns. The climatic regimes of our infrastructure and management systems are rapidly changing, which is why we need high-fidelity, real-time monitoring systems and tools to manage our precious waters, to respond to extreme climate events, and to keep our communities safe. The health and well-being and resilience of our communities depend on it. So we've heard today a lot about the impacts to weather forecasting, but I'd like to ask Mr. Mahoney in particular, could you please speak to some of the other specific Earth observing systems that are managed and utilized by the USGS, NOAA, USDA, and others that are critical for planning and responding to climate impacts to our communities?
Thank you, Representative, for the question. There are many dozens of satellites that are in space that are utilizing spectrum, not all of them in the same channel, obviously, but some of them are focused on, like Landsat, on visible imagery and multispectral channels that provide information for sea surface temperatures. They provide information for winds over the ocean. There are observations of soil moisture, soil temperature, vegetation state. All of these are important for understanding the land surface itself and to characterize it and looking for changes in the land surface, as well as these are all ingredients for weather forecasting. A lot of times people think that just predicting the weather involves just the atmosphere, but the fluxes between the land surface, the water surfaces, the cryosphere, and the atmosphere are absolutely critical. So actually the forecast process utilizes many of the data sets created from these multispectral channels across a lot of geosynchronous as well as polar orbiting satellites. So there are different frequencies that are used for these different areas. The 18.6 passive band, for example, is for sea surface wind speed and direction. The 23.8, as we've been talking about, is the water vapor channel. 36.5 is looking at tropical cyclone modeling and sea surface wind speed and direction. And we have the 50 to 60 gigahertz bands looking at vertical temperature profiles, and then a large number of visible channels as well. It's all part of the data collection, analysis, assimilation, and prediction process.
Thank you, Mr. Mahoney. So I just want to emphasize to say that what we're talking about here has broad and sweeping implications for all of our communities and their well-being, from our farmers' ability to utilize water and grow crops to put food on the table for our communities, to our ability to bring fresh water to our communities across the West. So it's critical that we address this issue. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back and am grateful for this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Feastra.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas, for this hearing and your request for the GAO report on frequency spectrum management. I also want to thank our witnesses for your testimony and sharing your extensive research. Mr. Mahoney, in your written testimony, you note the impacts of what spectrum interference and weather accuracy can have on the agricultural community. Similarly, I am currently drafting legislation trying to find technological solutions to weather radar blockages and ghost echoes. Getting accurate weather information can save both lives and livelihoods and of those in my district. We saw several tornadoes last week in Iowa, which were quite tragic. In 2019, a report sponsored by NIST suggested that we have lost the ability to rely on GPS due to an outage. It would cost our economy about $1 billion a day if this happens. However, in Section 5 of the report, it noted that an outage during the springtime planting season could increase losses closer to $1.5 billion a day. Can you elaborate on the reasons for the difference between the two figures? And can you elaborate on all the ways farmers and ranchers can utilize GPS in their operations and how they could be impacted by spectrum interference bleeding over from these other frequencies? Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, for the question. I can't comment specifically on the financial differences, but I certainly can comment on the utilization of weather information and land surface information for precision agriculture. Certainly, the invention of the GPS for navigation has provided farm machinery a lot more of an ability to identify exactly where, on the land surface, and a lot of the sensing technologies has allowed farmers to understand what the chemical content is of their soil, the moisture content, the temperature, information from remote sensing on where the pests are and what the vegetation state is. Interference in any of those data sets is going to impact farming significantly. If you mentioned the radars, Doppler weather radar in the S-band, the NexRad network, there are other weather radars that are operated as C-band and X-band. Interference in any of those bands is going to impact the ability not only to see the storms in real time, but to assimilate the storm data in the weather prediction process. Contaminating the data sets that are fundamental ingredients of the weather prediction process is going to affect millions and millions of stakeholders. And agriculture is very sensitive to severe weather, as well as day-to-day weather in terms of temperature, humidity, wind speed, and land surface conditions. And so it's paramount that the spectrum be protected and those data sets of high quality for those purposes.
Thank you for those comments, Mr. Mahoney. I do have a follow-up comment. Could the use of spectrum in weather forecasting be used as a tool to supplement incomplete or lost radar data? And how would Iowa farmers be adversely affected by the potential or diminished weather forecasts due to spectrum interferences?
There are satellites that are essentially radars in space that can help fill in gaps where a terrestrial radar system may see interference. But they are often polar orbiting, and their return period is pretty long. And the NEXRAD system, for example, operates where it collects an entire volume of the atmosphere about every 10 or 12 minutes. So I think it would be very hard to have a satellite-based radar system with the fidelity of a ground-based radar system replace or fill in the gaps from interference. The passive channels are primarily focused on water vapor and temperature, and not specifically on hydrometeors or precipitation particles and the severe weather events themselves. So I would there are some methodologies that could be used to fill in some of the gaps, kind of the radar by radar basis, but using satellite assets to try to do that, I think, would be challenging.
Yeah, I would agree. Hey, thank you so much.
If I may add to that, Congressman, there are some interim measures from geostationary orbit combining two of the current sensors that can somewhat backfill for that case. I know in the instance where the radar in Puerto Rico was completely destroyed by hurricane, that those alternate methods were helpful to the local weather forecast office.
Very good comments. Thank you so much, and thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Vanna, you discussed the report GAO recently published on spectrum management and agency collaboration. And in your report, you discuss how impacted federal agencies had multiple opportunities to comment through the IRAC and declined to do so. And one of your recommendations is that NOAA actually establish written procedures to deal with spectrum sharing issues, which they lacked at the time. What steps can Congress take to ensure federal agencies are properly engaging in the spectrum management process so that decisions that are years in the making don't catch folks seemingly unaware?
Thank you for that question, Representative Sherrill. Yeah, indeed, there were numerous opportunities where NOAA and NASA could have raised concerns through the IRAC, through NTIA, and in fact, NTIA's job is to represent federal agencies' views and perspectives within, in FCC proceedings. At the time, NOAA decided not to do so because they didn't feel that they had the technical basis with which to challenge what was happening in the FCC proceeding. Also, partly what our recommendation to NOAA was really for them to get some of their internal processes in order to, and as I think it was alluded to earlier in this hearing, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of time frames that you got to meet. There's, the FCC proceeding may open. It's very complicated. They give you a short window to comment. And so it really does require an agency to have some ability to track that regulatory proceeding. And NASA recognized this during the course of our audit and actually did, institute those kinds of internal procedures. And so we think those internal procedures are important. And I think it's important for the committee to ensure that NOAA and NASA and agencies that, you have a jurisdiction over, do implement those kinds of recommendations so that they're ready when the time comes.
And do you have any more recommendations for that, either formal or informal, that you did include in the report that could help prevent this kind of incident from happening in the future?
Nothing that we didn't put in the report. I'll put it that way.
Congresswoman, can I make a suggestion as well, please?
Please.
We studied this pretty intensively at the CSMAC, and then I've been involved in the process both on the government and the private sector, government side as well. I think there needs to be more staff to be able to support these efforts, technical staff. I think every agency involved is very short on staffing and the ability at the ITU to travel to the ITU and actively participate in meetings. That's one thing. But the other thing, too, is there really needs to be increased communications and improved communications between NTIA and the FCC, not just at the principals level, but also at the staff level. And if you look at the CSMAC report, a number of recommendations we focused on were things to improve that, including doing some research together, developing propagation models that could be used, automated sharing mechanism analysis, and so forth. So I really think having increased collaboration is good. I mean, at one point we even recommended that perhaps you put people in the same office building if people are going back to work, or you do details to one another's agencies. And I think anything to increase communications will help over the long term. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And then,
I'm sorry, I have to agree just that the domestic process, they're very skilled professionals, as you mentioned, but you do have to ask the question, if the scientists had been aware of this problem, or if there was a scientific input available into the regulatory process, would they have flagged this earlier and perhaps gotten their agencies to respond?
And then, thank you very much. And I just want to move on. I have 1 minute, Ms. Manner. Compared to other nations, whether they're allies like South Korea or adversaries like China, the U.S. government provides relatively little R&D support around spectrum use and telecommunications in general. It's really different from other sectors like energy, where we have the massive research functions of the Department of Energy, or health, where we have the National Institutes of Health. So should the federal R&D enterprise be doing more, or does spectrum and telecom research need to stay more with the private sector?
Thank you for the question. I think both. My industry, the commercial satellite industry, wouldn't be around if it wasn't for the NASA research efforts. So it must be in the 1980s already, of the ACT system, the Advanced Communications Satellite Systems, that really form the basis for everything you're seeing today, from our systems, our Jupiter systems, to Starlink, to whatever. It was all basis back then. But I also think having the government actively involved in spectrum research is critical. And that's why both at the CSMAC and individually, I would urge that we do advance the agencies for looking at things like modeling based on updated technologies, spectrum sharing analysis. So I think on both sides it would be helpful. Thank you for the question.
Thanks to all our witnesses. I have more questions, but I'm going to have to submit them to the record. Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. LaTurna.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My question is for Ms. Manner. The FCC Chairwoman recently stated that it was a mistake to focus on the millimeter wave spectrum band for 5G auctions. And this was touched on a little bit earlier, but I'm wondering if you could go into a little more depth. 5G utilizes 600 megahertz to 39 gigahertz. In your opinion, are we making a mistake auctioning off the 24 gigahertz spectrum specifically, since we have such practical applications for it?
Thank you for the question. I can't speak specifically 24 gigahertz because I don't have a lot of experience in it, but I would say overall from the millimeter wave, I do think that the FCC's analysis on any of the bands, and it actually went up to 50 gigahertz, the proceeding, did not accurately or adequately examine or include in the analysis the impacts on commercial industries like the satellite industry, as well as scientific industries. And that goes back to the balance issue that I talked about earlier. There needs to be a broader analysis that includes more than short-term economic gains, which is often the case with 5G. And there needs to be a broader decision-making. And I think by having the MOU improved, I think you can start to get there. But yes, I did have concerns about the proceeding as someone who was actively involved in that proceeding.
Well, I'll allow anybody to comment on this. And I don't know the answer, but if obviously the mid-band is useful for commercial applications, and clearly above 24 gigahertz is useful, why then why is it necessary to auction off the 24 gigahertz? Can any of you comment on that?
Congressman Turner, I can. Thank you for that question. Obviously, growth and dissemination of this information at so-called 5G high band frequencies plays an important role in the overall process. But besides 24 gigahertz, one of the most critical passive bands lies in the 50 gigahertz region and upwards nearer 60. That's where atmospheric temperatures are determined by these satellites. All these bands are used interactively. There really isn't a separate application for one versus the other, but the 50 gigahertz band would be extremely crucial if it encountered interference. And there are services allocated right up to the edge that currently do not have service rules applied to the FCC, but the approvals are already there.
Well, let's stick with you, Mr. Lubar. Talk specifically, if you can, about the vulnerability that the U.S. military or scientific satellites could face from spectrum interference from an attack from a foreign entity.
Well, I think that's a bit of a different question because
it's a wholly different question. I'm switching gears a little bit.
Yes, sir. It would depend on certainly the type of functionality on one of those given satellites, whether you're impeding a communication systems by actively jamming it, whether you were intentionally or unintentionally causing interference to something like we're talking about here in passive situations. It might be a little more difficult to implement that as ground-based interference from a foreign entity. But I think that the roadmap of spectrum allocations is intentionally designed to try to protect for people that are following the roadmap from causing those kind of issues.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Von Aw, in the research that you've done about the process, is there any light you can shed on the question that I started out asking Ms. Manor? In terms of why the focus on the 24 gigahertz or what the breakdown potentially is?
Absolutely, Representative Turner. So, as 5G has, sort of the promise of 5G is, more capacity, particularly in, where there are, heavy uses, a lot of population. These higher bands can carry more data, so they're desirable from that aspect. They require a lot more antennas, a lot more radios and so on that are within a very small area, which is what we're talking about here, which is what creates some of that potential interference to these passive bands. But that's the reason that they're looking for those higher wavelengths, those higher bands of spectrum, because of the higher data that it can carry.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Foster.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess as this committee's physicist in residence, and maybe the only member of Congress who actually used to be able to calculate thermal emission spectra, I just like to emphasize the real advantages for the government of having active researchers in their employment. If for no other reason, simply having high quality technical advice available to government when decisions have to be made. And I have a technical question here for, I guess, Mr. Lubar, Dr. Girth, or really anyone who wants to answer. It's first off, how local spatially are the measurements that are being made here, and how bad is the contamination? Like, does one handset or one base station tower have the ability to puke up all of North America, or just the local county, or a few blocks around the piece of equipment when you look at the resolution you're going for, spatial resolution?
Congressman Foster, let me take that, and I might pass the gauntlet to Dr. Girth afterwards. You have to understand that these passive measurements are power measurements made over a physical area. So no, I don't think you could tell that one transmitter or one series of transmitters were contributing to the problem. The real issue is it's not a communication signal. It's not detecting what's individually occurring from the transmissions from a 5G system. Okay, it's measuring the power, if you will, really the fluctuation, as we showed at the beginning in the noise floor. It's a very minute measurement because, you're trying to pick up the natural emissions of the atmosphere. And so you might get it over a very wide angle. It's going to be different whether the sensor is pointed straight down at nadir or the type of sensor that scans to some extent, whereas it moves off to one side or the other, covers an area measured in kilometers. It also dwells about 20 times faster than a 5G signal. So you'd see a continuous change.
So along those lines, it seems like there may be a class of compromises available here where you'd essentially have 24 gigahertz quiet time, where, the cell phone systems would agree that for a few milliseconds every minute or something like that, they would just shut down and be quiet, let the scientists do their thing, and then start talking at 24 gigahertz again. I can't imagine those sort of discussions haven't taken place. Do they work technically from the scientific point of view and the cell phone performance point of view? And what are the trade-offs there? And from a policy point of view, it has the huge advantage that you can then adjust the policy of the amount of quiet time and the length of the quiet time after the equipment has been deployed. And so what's the technical status of that sort of possibility?
Well, so yes, that is a feasible process, but you have to go back and look at how many of the non-polar satellite sensors are in space, because it wouldn't help to just turn off, if it was possible, when a sensor was in use, say for an American satellite from NOAA. You'd have to also do it for all the other satellites that are taking data in this band, because everybody uses the data from all of those satellites. So it could get to be, somewhat more intrusive. You'd have to have the knowledge of the satellite paths.
Well, we have pretty good software engineers in this country for be able to handle things like that. The information exists, the things can be planned ahead of time. And I was just wondering, in terms of the scientific capability of making that measurement, if you had an agreement that we're going to now shut down for the next few milliseconds all the cell phone equipment in Miami, and then anyone who happens to be focusing on Miami would just understand that this is the sweet time to make the measurement. That's why I was asking about the geographic selectivity of the antennas that were pointed down. And is this, this is something obviously that has to be heavily negotiated, and something where I think the government has to do a better job of doing that kind of negotiation. Are there serious attempts to design such systems?
Sir, I'm not aware of it. I think it would be, there are more elements involved in this. I think Dr. Girth can make a few quick comments about it.
Yeah, if I can, Representative, I would just note that for the ATMS sensor, the pixel that's being sensed is somewhere between 10 and 50 kilometers. That partially depends on the frequency that's being sensed and its distance from the satellite subpoint. Mr. Lubar made the good point that the satellites are moving, and there's lots, and there may be more satellites in the future. Comparatively, for a mission at 24 gigahertz, that probably would cover on the order of about a football field. So it would really depend on how many different transmitters are within that pixel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Well, if you could think about that and send me some information. And just in my last few questions, as a proud graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, is Ed Eloranta still shooting LiDAR systems off the top of the engineering building there?
Yes, he is. There's a great green glow coming out of the building on some evenings.
Okay, great. Well, say hi to Ed and yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Obermolte.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. This hearing has been really fascinating. I want to ask a big picture question, because obviously we've been talking about the process and how it broke down and how we didn't get discourse between the various user communities here. But I want to talk about the bigger issue of how we make decisions as a government as to which uses to prioritize for different pieces of spectrum. And I know in Dr. Girth's testimony, he was careful to say it's not us versus them. And I understand that these user communities are not necessarily fighting against each other, but from a governance standpoint, it is one group versus the other, because we make these decisions about which group gets the spectrum and which don't. So Mr. Mahoney, I know, said there's no alternative other than protection for this particular use. But this isn't the only use, right? There's other basic science that relies on other pieces of the spectrum. So I'm just wondering, how we can balance these different needs. And I'd like to start with Ms. Manner, because you said in your testimony something I thought was very interesting about the need for balancing our national interests. So in your opinion, how should we come up with a policy that balances the needs of basic science against the needs of commercial uses for spectrum?
So, and I do want to say that commercial interest isn't always against sciences. So as a commercial operator, oftentimes we're in the same, we're working together, and we may even be using the same systems. So I think there has to be a broader view. There's just some certain facts. At the end of the day, a lot of this is driven by economics. The wireless industry is very strong and very powerful. And of course, there's an important need for 5G in the country. We want to be the leader in 5G. But I think when the FCC looks at this and there's two different issues. There's the domestic and the international side. Is can we expand the range of areas that we looked at? And that's why I pointed out that the FCC has a narrower standard, the public interest standard, than executive branch agencies, which often have a national interest standard. So I think having those two come together, and we did look at more, I would say the CSMAC looked at more than just revising the FCC NTIA MOU. We also looked at the structure of the government. One of the unique things about the U.S. spectrum management process is we have a different agency that handles government allocations from one that handles commercial. I can't tell you I've made up my mind what the right approach is, but I do think looking at that as well as what we're talking about here with the MOU would be an important part of what I think Congress should be doing is, and we haven't looked at this in 100 years, and that's why I brought up the 100 years. So I don't have the perfect answer, but I think there are ways to improve things.
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree with you. And like you, I don't think that that pure economics is the right approach. Congresswoman Ross asked a related question in which the discussion revolved around trying to figure out the value of predictive weather science, economically, which, I think ignores the need to do basic science. But I agree that something needs to be done there. And a related question for Mr. Van Ah. So in your testimony, you were talking about the need for agreeing on processes when we have parties and agencies that can't reach consensus. Do you believe that Congress needs to set guidelines in that case? And if so, what should those guidelines entail and who should determine them?
Thank you for that question. So at this point, we don't necessarily think that Congress needs to step in. We think that the agencies within their authorities can figure out the protocols and processes needed to come to decisions and make sure that all perspectives are being adequately considered. So within the MOU that FCC and NTIA have within the general guidance document that state is sort of the gatekeeper of, there are ways that you can sort of develop those protocols. It could be something as simple as, well, if we disagree, who's the next in line that we talk to, and when that the corresponding person in the other agency, and so on until you come to some sort of resolution. Or if you don't, what is the sort of the ultimate decision maker there? So we think that there are things that can be done within the agency's authority.
Can I add one piece, Congressman? Thank you. So I would say the international process is somewhat different because you have the State Department involved. And I've been on WRC delegations since 1995. And I've seen us evolve to where State Department was the mediator and the few times, including over government versus commercial spectrum uses, as opposed to now where you just don't have State Department playing that role. So I know this is inconsistent with the GAO report, but based on my experience, I really do think you have to have the State Department back into that role as a mediator for the WRC process because of their really broad view, including the international view that they take, where NTIA and the FCC, of course, are domestic agencies. But you have to staff the State Department appropriately. And right now, I do not believe they have appropriate staffing to play that role. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bowman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Mahoney, thank you for your testimony. You emphasized that remotely sensed weather data is crucial for integrating more wind and solar into the grid. Can you say more about the implications of the green energy transition for this discussion as we quickly ramp up wind and solar to reach 100% renewable electricity? What does this say about the need to protect, prioritize, or even expand our federal spectrum assets for gathering Earth system data?
Thank you for the question, Representative. Wind and variable generation energy like wind and solar are extremely sensitive to the weather and weather prediction. The utilities in the United States and around the world have always been challenged with integrating variable generation resources into a grid when they've been traditionally used to running generators at very precise levels to match the demand for power generation. So early on, when wind and solar were first being added to the grid at very small levels, the variations and the lack of predictability of those resources was not a very big deal. I mean, it really didn't affect the overall load very much because it was such a small fraction of the overall generation. But now in various parts of the country, solar is heading towards 10% generation or more. You've got wind energy on some days over 50 or 60% of the power generation. And if the utilities cannot predict ahead of time when those resources are going to come, they may not be able to meet the demand. And so having very precise predictions of wind speed then converted and turbulence and wind shear converted to power output for wind energy is extremely critical to manage the load and to balance the load in these utility networks. Same for solar. It's very sensitive to aerosols. It's very sensitive to haze and certainly clouds and precipitation. And those are very challenging scientific problems to really understand exactly when the clouds are going to pass by. Having the remotely sensed data, the passive channel data available to the weather forecasting process significantly increases our ability to predict the wet processes in the atmosphere, which are very important for solar generation. So as we work with the Department of Energy and the utilities, we're seeing larger demands on forecast precision for atmospheric variables really important for renewable energy generation.
Thank you, Mr. Mahoney. Dr. Girth, thank you for your testimony as well. Would you like to comment on this?
I think Mr. Mahoney, you summarized it very, very well. The predictability of weather is helpful for utilities to manage their demand in multiple areas. I know particularly in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of reliance on hydroelectric, and some of that has to enter the grid because they have to control the river flows. So prediction of when certain types of renewable energy sources will be most beneficial to the utilities is very important to know. And I think in the context of this discussion, microwave data is one of the leaders in the predictability of weather phenomena to help them in the 12-hour to 4-day period. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Von R., the National Institute of Standards and Technology operates a national spectrum test network called NASTN in conjunction with NTIA, NOAA, and NASA, and other agencies. I understand this test network wasn't operational during the 24 gigahertz saga. What do you believe should be the role of federal spectrum test networks in the spectrum regulatory process?
Thank you for that question, Representative Bowman. So we think they can play an important role, certainly. As we reported in our report, that there was sort of a lack of agreed upon procedures and approaches and agreed upon methods and parameters for how to conduct the studies at issue for the 24 gigahertz band. And so organizations like NIST, the National Academy of Sciences, and others can play an important role as sort of a third-party arbiter, if you will, to help those agencies understand those parameters and how they should be used. So our recommendation was really for the agencies to kind of come to an agreement about what kind of approach to use. We didn't necessarily recommend that they use a third party, but they can certainly have that kind of benefit.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Babin.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to thank our witnesses as well. On September the 8th, 2011, this committee held a hearing on Light Squared's, which is now Legato's, proposal to operate in the spectrum adjacent to the GPS signal. Federal science agencies were unanimous in their opposition to this proposal and cited significant impacts to lives, property, the economy, and national security. Despite the agency's assessments, the NTIA prevented the agencies from transparently communicating these impacts. In fact, this committee had to hold a hearing and call each agency to testify to get them to communicate the risks. More recently, the committee heard of similar risks to our nation's weather prediction capabilities caused by the FCC's 24 gigahertz auction, Once again, the agency's impact assessments were prevented from seeing the light of day. This compelled the chairwoman and ranking member to call for the GAO report that was released yesterday. The GAO's report reinforces the lack of transparency that this committee has encountered. As we seek to open up more spectrum to enable the 5G economy, would it be beneficial for individual agencies to communicate their impact assessments directly to the FCC through the public docket, as well as the existing process where they submit their assessments to the NTIA for a whole of government policy on FCC decisions? I understand the importance of coordinating federal positions, but as we've seen in the past, this process can be used to muzzle potential impact assessments. This committee has a history of leveraging transparency and peer review. Would the nation's spectrum management process benefit from these principles as well? Mr. Von Ah, I meant to mention that your name at the beginning, but this was a question for you. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Congressman. So, yes, there are, the way that this is supposed to work is through the NTIA committee, through the IRAC, and NTIA is, as in its role, is to represent federal agencies' equities before FCC, during in FCC proceedings. That said, there are several examples where federal agencies have submitted comments directly to FCC proceedings outside of the NTIA process, and we currently have some work kind of looking more closely at that. But the reasoning behind it being that they felt they needed to emphasize the importance of their point of view and their perspective. When it comes to sort of the studies here at issue, I mean, we certainly think as GAO, we tend to believe in transparency, and we believe that FCC should have all the relevant information before it makes decisions. In this case, of course, I would mention that these studies are sort of first of their kind studies that were being conducted. So we also, as GAO, appreciate accuracy and reliability in these studies. And that they're actually, vetted through all affected parties, which is sort of where the IRAC is supposed to play its role. In this case, we really think it was, the coordination between NTIA and FCC, the use of the IRAC committee, the use of just their, everyday sort of ability to coordinate, that really didn't bring these issues up, didn't really delve into these issues enough, and that's sort of where it broke down.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. LeBar. There is considerable debate between federal agencies regarding what the best emission limit for companies operating in the 24.25 to the 24.45 band, the band which is adjacent to the 24 gigahertz spectrum restricted for earth science and radio astronomy observations. NASA and NOAA argue that a minus 20 decibel watt emission limit would cause significant degradation of weather data and forecasting accuracy, and call for a minus 52.4 decibel watt limit. However, international treaties currently set the standard at minus 33 decibel watt. What do you believe is the best emissions limit?
Thank you, Congressman Babin, for that question. Sure. The ITU process in this case was a multi-year function where administrations and interested parties supplied information to a technical working group where they received information about the prospective systems from experts, minus 50, minus 40. There were a number of inputs in the initial parts of the proceeding up to the preparatory meetings in February of 2019. With the US, the only one in putting minus 20 decibel watts. I don't know the strategy of what happened there, but I would like to point out that minus 20 decibel watts and the requirement in the FCC rules in Part 30, Section 30.203 are the same identical number, minus 13 decibel milliwatts. So there are some questions about how that number was derived.
Okay, thank you. It looks like I'm out of time, Madam Chair, so I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our panelists for today's hearing. Dr. Girth, I understand you're from the Midwest, and I'm not sure how much you have heard about the rain that has been pouring down in southeastern Michigan this summer, and how desperately so many Michiganders just want it to stop, particularly as many households in southeastern Michigan are now flooding for the second time. However, if we really can't make the rain stop, as you know, we sure want to know about how much downpour is expected so that we can prepare. In addition to NASA's role in developing weather satellites operated by NOAA, NASA's own platforms, for example, the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, Microwave Imager, or GMI, rely on the 24 gigahertz water vapor band for basic Earth and climate science measurements. So, Dr. Girth, how does spectrum interference affect NASA's basic science research with instruments such as GMI?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman Stevens. And yes, I do appreciate the diversity of the weather in the Midwest and how quickly it changes and the effects of all of that. Broadly speaking, about the value of weather satellites, there's really two roles. One of which is to look at longer term climate and to understand the physical processes of the atmosphere. So we want to know, as scientists, the actual trigger mechanisms for what's called precipitation efficiency, for example. So we know there's water vapor in the atmosphere. We've talked a lot about water vapor in 23.8, but that's not necessarily water in the ground. And so that water vapor has to be condensed into a thunderstorm and then rained out, and then that's the impact. So NASA's missions is often looking at how do we conduct basic science to understand that process. If we transition over to NOAA, it's about making those forecasts in real time. So taking what we learned from the NASA mission and using the NOAA missions to routinely update the weather prediction models and then issue the warnings and forecasts that are needed to save lives and make the public aware.
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Vanal, the impacts to weather forecasts due to interference to 24 gigahertz are clearly a significant concern that's been talked about a couple of different times today. And I understand that there are other spectral bands that these passive instruments rely upon, as well as what the FCC might be looking at to auction next. So as a Congresswoman from Michigan, I'm certainly focused and concerned about our roads and our basic infrastructure. And that is why I'm also concerned about the FCC's decision to reallocate the 5.9 gigahertz band, which will pose serious risks to our transportation safety long term as we look for innovative ways to utilize technology to make our roads safer. So, Mr. Vanna, is your sense that the United States spectrum management process are currently better structured than they were in 2019 to avoid another 24 gigahertz type saga in the future? And how can we improve this process to better results?
Thank you for that question, Representative Stevens. So I don't think we would have made recommendations if we thought it was particularly better than it was in 2019. So no, we do think that there are some areas for improvement for the agencies to better coordinate. We've sort of illuminated those in the report in terms of having the ability to agree upon an approach for study, where there are harmful interference does come up. And an approach for the agencies to better coordinate earlier on and to be able to identify areas of disagreement and ways to resolve that disagreement. So we're looking for changes to the documents and protocols that guide the agency coordination. Of course, I would just mention, the way that we've set up spectrum management here in this country is sort of leads to sort of necessarily having some needed coordination, right? And we'll have sort of questions over whether this use or that use is the best use, right? So strengthening these the ability of these agencies to coordinate earlier on, particularly where there are a lot of competing interests, is sort of critically important to be able to avoid issues like we saw in 24 gigahertz. I would also just mention quickly, we have some ongoing work on 5.9 gigahertz band as well that we should be issuing sometime early next year.
Excellent. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, witnesses.
Thank you very much. Mr. Caston.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses. Mr. Lubar and Dr. Girth, I'd like to direct my questions to you, and I want to get your responses specifically to some comments that former FCC Chairman Ajit Pai said about the auction off of the above 24 gigahertz spectrum. He specifically said, quote, "The federal government and private sector have deployed nearly 40,000 high-powered fixed microwave links in the 21.2 to 23.6 gigahertz band, immediately below and actually adjacent to the 23.6 to 24 gigahertz passive band at the same emission limit the FCC adopted for 5G operations. No interference has ever been reported." The FCC repeated that argument in a lot of public filings and in oral communications with members of Congress. Now, obviously, we're talking here about that satellite and weather observation band in the 23.8 range, where we have, but in the band just below that Mr. Pai was referencing, we have point-to-point microwave links. So, Mr. Lubar and Dr. Girth, I'd like to get both your answers, and I have 5 questions. The first 4 are short, and then I'd like you just to sort of give me your feedback. So hopefully if we could just be short on the first 4, I would appreciate it. Number 1, do point-to-point microwave lengths in the lower frequency band, so below that band, tend to be noisy enough, and are there enough of them to cause impact to measurements in the passive band where the weather satellites are watching?
Congressman, thank you for the question. The point-to-point microwave links wouldn't have the same density as a 5G system. Yes, it is somewhat possible that when you compute all the apportionments of energy that might cause interference, they might factor the equation, but no. I mean, I think in general, they're not anywhere near the type of violator that you would find in a system like that.
So no, and I'm sorry to be short, but I want to get through this quickly. So no there. Dr. Girth, do you agree?
I agree.
Okay. Are the telecom activities that are being deployed in the higher frequency band inherently noisier than the point-to-point lower microwave links?
Congressman, it's a matter of what type of signal bounces upward. The signal in 5G isn't pointed that way, but they can bounce off the ground or the building or the terrain and eventually be seen by the passive sensor.
So I'm sorry, is that a yes or a no? Are they noisier at the higher end?
So yes, it's a yes.
Okay.
Yes, I agree.
Girth?
Yes, I agree.
Okay. Mr. Pai also noted that 40,000 devices, sounds like a big number, were deployed in the lower frequency band. How does that compare to the number of devices that will be deployed in the higher frequency band?
I would think it's a much smaller number. I mean, for a 5G installation, you would require a particularly high density, and as build-out occurs, 40,000 would be a small number. It also would depend on what you could see simultaneously at one point in time in one of these satellite sensors.
When you say small, are we talking factor of 2, factor of 10, factor of 100, or can you speculate?
I don't know, sir, without.
Okay.
You have to submit something for the record.
Okay. Dr. Girth on that one?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Lubar, or with Mr. Lubar on that.
Okay. So these 40,000 devices in the lower frequency band were individually licensed, while the larger number of devices in the higher frequency band will not be. Will that make it harder or easier to mitigate potential interference from them in the passive band? The fact that they're not individually licensed?
Well, sir, you're not going to see interference from an individual sensor. As I said, these radiometers are measuring power over a large volume. So it's the conglomerate contribution of all of them to cause the problem.
Okay. Dr. Girth?
It's going to be much harder if they're not licensed. The only way to mitigate, or really shouldn't even say mitigate, to eliminate interference is to know who is causing the interference in the first place. And if that is not known, then how are we going to do that?
Okay, so now to my larger question. I have 40 seconds left. Given all this, do you think that the FCC's comparisons of the below band, the above band, was a scientifically robust apples to apples comparison? And do you find that to be a good faith argument on the part of Mr. Pai?
I'm not going to comment one way or the other on whether I think Mr. Pai made a good faith argument, but I do think that no, I don't think they're equivalent. Just because, as I said, the density, and when you think of a microwave link, it's essentially like a flashlight beam being pointed parallel to the surface of the Earth. Not all of its energy has the same opportunity to bounce upward as a moving signal on the Earth.
Dr. Girth, any final comments?
It's a watermelons to grapes argument.
Well said. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Paul Muddle.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And as I guess one of the token lawyers on the Science Committee, my question, and I don't want to embarrass the Coloradans on the panel, but I have a very simple science question, and I might embarrass the staff, but I serve on several committees. One of them is the Financial Services Committee, where we're dealing with nano trading, that we don't want some entity to get ahead of everybody else in the trading and get some advantage. So my question is, there's a basic assumption here that the spectrum is a finite resource. So can somebody tell me why that is so? Can't we, in listening to everybody, there's the K band and the S band and the T band, and I'm not a ham operator or scientist, but why can't we just keep cutting thinner slices to have this? And is it the fact that the slices are so thin, that's why we have interference? So just a basic science question.
Congressman Perlmutter, first I'll say greetings to a fellow Coloradan. Yes, sir, the spectrum is such that you can't make any more of it. It is a finite amount. The nice thing about spectrum is if you stop using it, you can immediately reuse it for something else. But it's already been cut and parsed by the way it is allocated. And so the simple decisions on spectrum sharing, I think, have already been made. I think that's really the crux of the matter.
So we couldn't keep slicing it thinner. We've already cut it up already.
Can I add to that too? I'm sorry.
Yes, please.
So we can, so the allocations can change. That's what we do at the ITU, and that's what the FCC does in its rulemaking. So it's the keeper of the allocation table. So we can change them. We can make more efficient use. We also have new technologies which come on, which enable more efficient use of the spectrum. So for instance, from satellite, we went to spot beams, which increases efficiency. We also have sharing metrics. So there are ways to increase the efficiency of the use, but it's still a finite resource. And there is a fair amount of spectrum that, even though it's allocated and assigned to users, is not being used today. There's analyses out there that certain industries have large portions of their spectrum that they're not putting to use today. So there's no policeman to make sure that it's being used efficiently.
All right. So from a policy standpoint, we could ask to reallocate some of this that's not being used. Is that what you're saying, Ms. Manner?
Yeah, it has ramifications because people are licensed and so forth. But yes, theoretically, you could.
Okay. So I guess from another kind of science question that I have, if what we're concerned about is interference and that it bleeds from one band to another band, I mean, technologically, similar to Dr. Foster's question, where he's saying, well, everybody go quiet for a second so that the scientists can do their work, or for a millisecond or a nanosecond. I mean, are there other technologies that are helping us clear this interference, or is that sort of impenetrable too? And I'd ask Mr. Lubar, Mr. Mahoney, I mean, what are we doing technologically to protect these scientific endeavors that we have?
Congressman, thank you for that question. As I mentioned earlier, one of the ways you could do it is to survey the RF environment and just understand that for the passive bands that the contamination is occurring. Now, I happen to have something here that might be useful. As you know, Colorado has a lot of resources, both in atmospheric sciences and space. And I mentioned that an RF survey of the environment would be useful. This happens to be a fully functional, full-size radiometer that could fly on a small satellite, and it would detect and help identify if there were issues in several of these bands. Obviously, it can be flown on a small satellite fairly quickly. You're talking a device here that was built actually in Colorado by one of our small companies, Boulder Environmental Sciences and Technology. I'd say a device like this is something about $500,000 to a $250,000 range, and I'd say a system to fly it would probably be in the few millions of dollar range to operate. And so The real issue with the passive interference is you don't know today if it's occurring, and you need to understand whether you have that contamination and whether it's getting into the data.
And something like that would help us figure out the passive interference?
This, along with what we suggested prior, to actually mount something on the satellite system of interest, right on the ATMS sensor or next door to it.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate Mr. Mahoney didn't get a chance to ask you any questions, but I'm glad we have two Coloradans on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. I'd like to address the first concern to Ms. Manner. I love your testimony, but you started with the really good point that we're virtually the only country that had both this bifurcated process, the FCC and NTIA, and then talked about the three categories: the unified agency, and then proposals repurpose, and then the workarounds. And then we spent the rest of the time talking about the workarounds. Why don't we just merge them? What are the political battles to put it into one that manages this, rather than having to like put people in the same building and insist they talk to each other?
So thank you, Congressman, for your question. And at the CSMAC, this was, you'll notice if you go to the CSMAC's report, we didn't have a recommendation on that issue because there are concerns. Some people, and it's really a question of where do you put it and how do you weigh the equities? So one nice thing as a commercial operator is the FCC does understand, purpose is on the commercial side and public safety, and the government side is NTIA. So there is, will you be able to balance the equities if you're in a single agency? It's a good question. So, the question is whose jurisdiction? Is it an executive branch agency? There is something nice about having an independent regulatory agency that's not subject to political will. And I go back to a colleague of mine who remembers back in the day where, you don't want someone's friend calling and asking for a political favor for a license. So you're trying to insulate from political will. So that would be one argument in favor of an independent commission. The executive branch, of course, has a broader mission in terms of national security and so forth. So it's a question. It's a very hard question, but we certainly could do that.
Great. Thank you very much. For Mr. Von Ahn and Dr. Girth, one thing we learned from the 24 gigahertz is that there's no obligation on the part of the NTIA or the administration to make spectrum interference studies conducted by a federal agency available to the public. So this committee and the stakeholder committee were aware for months that NOAA and NASA had prepared a study that suggests significant harmful interference would result from the FCC's proposed emission limits. But it wasn't made public by the FCC in their docket, nor by NTIA, and nobody in Congress laid eyes on them until very late in the process. Meanwhile, the study results from industry stakeholders seeking a slice of the 24 gigahertz were publicly posted by the FCC. Note that the NOAA and NASA studies are not deliberative policy documents, but technical analysis performed by agency engineers. So, Mr. Von Ah, as a general matter, would GAO tell us that more transparency is helpful or hurtful in trying to reach a more harmonious whole of government approach for spectrum management?
Thank you for that question, Representative Byer. I mean, absolutely, GAO would be sort of on the side of transparency here, as well as the side of accuracy and reliability of studies. I mean, one of the things that is at issue here is how the process works, and it works differently for the federal agencies than it would for a private company. So the federal agencies are when they're doing these studies in preparation for the WRC, they're working under the authority, so to speak, of the general guidance document, which sort of outlines different roles and responsibilities. That's where, and there's technical committees that they're doing these studies for. Whereas a private company can simply just submit something to the record in the FCC proceeding. Why and where or when NTIA and the agency should have submitted something to the FCC proceeding is another question, but they decided they didn't have the technical basis to do so.
Well, that sounds like a T-ball question, so thank you for hitting it out of the park. Dr. Girth, you're an atmospheric scientist by training. What would the scientific process say we should know about making technical scientific studies available so they can be evaluated by anyone who wants to take a look? Or how upset are you that you couldn't see these studies?
I was very upset about it, to be honest with you. Scientific process really dictates that any work that's conducted be made available to the community. And perhaps then it is open to criticism from the scientific community, but I consider that to be a good thing. And we certainly don't want preliminary work necessarily disseminated. However, to have a full and open record, it's really just a matter of scientific integrity. And I think NOAA and NASA really need to separate decisions from inputs. And scientific work is an input to a decision-making process. Thank you.
And I assume this is also scientific work paid for by the taxpayer. So.
Absolutely. In most cases, it is, yes.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here today for this really important conversation. For most of us, we don't think about or talk about spectrum on a daily basis, but we all certainly use it in our everyday activity. Our phones, these computers that we're speaking through, televisions, everyday uses rely obviously on this critical asset. But as we discussed today, spectrum is not just for consumer use. Critical scientific observation relies on access as well. And so I'm curious, with these size limitations that have been discussed, or some of the questions that come around capacity, I'm anxious to get thoughts on how we ensure that our scientific agencies have uninterrupted access to spectrum needed to perform their vital work, as the last few months have demonstrated, with extreme temperatures, parts of the country facing drought, wildfires, and then, as Congresswoman Stevens from Michigan, my colleague from Michigan, mentioned, serious flooding. The work of our climate scientists and meteorologists is critical for the well-being of our planet. But climate science depends on cooperation between agencies, not just between agencies in one government, but between countries. And I understand that we rely not only on both NASA and NOAA satellites for this essential information, for this data, but also on satellite measurements from our international partners. And I say this because my district borders Canada, not on land, but we border Canada in my district in the middle of Lake Huron. The Great Lakes are a shared resource between our two countries, and both actively monitor conditions. And so if I could address this to Dr. Girth, if you could address how, if at all, do the spectrum issues that we were discussing during the course of this hearing today, how do those issues impact our collaboration with international partners such as Canada in weather and earth science, in the collection of that data and in the utilization of that necessary information? Dr. Girth?
Thank you so much for that question. And it does touch on a very good point that we should make, is that the United States uses many international satellite missions to contribute to the climate record and for weather monitoring, particularly satellites in Europe. If you look at the spectrum environment, if Canada were to pursue a completely different policy from the United States, and one country would have interference in a certain band where we're trying to measure the weather and the other wouldn't, the weather doesn't stop halfway through Lake Huron, as I think most Michiganders probably know. So we have to be very careful to make sure that the U.S. is leading from a position that protects all of the Americas. And quite frankly, if we're going to push the frontiers of weather forecasting to 10 days, to 14 days, we really need to have good observations, not only with Canada, but also over Asia, Oceania, and so forth. So very good question. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if any of the other panelists have thoughts on this particular question.
If I might add, maybe going back a little bit to the previous discussion where we have NOAA in particular doing studies that aren't communicated more broadly to the scientific community. Many of our federal agencies have millions and millions, hundreds of millions of users of their data. And so I'm often concerned that if the agencies are worried about spectrum, they may be too focused on their own mission, but not the rest of the enterprise that utilizes the data flowing out of those agencies. And we need to ensure that their voices are heard also in these discussions. There are some private sector weather companies that are serving up weather products to over 1 billion people a day.
I would just add quickly, Congressman, that there are communication systems in Canada, as well as the modeling that Canada does itself with this data. It is certainly possible to have interference across the boundaries for critical things that the Canadians derive from joint U.S. and Canadian systems, such as water and fire sensors.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you all for your testimony at today's hearing. We really appreciate the work you do. Madam Chair, I appreciate your holding this hearing, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much, and I believe that concludes our questions. But before we bring the hearing to a close, I want to thank all of our witnesses for testifying before the committee today. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members, and for any additional questions the committee may ask the witnesses. The witnesses are now excused, and the hearing is adjourned.